Hello, creepy creature kids and wicked little weirdos. This is your buddy Aiden, and another buddy too. Thank you for joining me once again for another Scapula comic commentary. This one for Gemini's Copycat Counterattack from Scapula, Doubly Dark and Deadly. It's always fun to do these videos, and if you guys enjoy them too, thank you so very much for coming back. And if you'd like to support me as well and follow along in the video, there's a couple of ways to do so. Grab a physical copy of Scapula, Doubly Dark and Deadly. This is available in the Scapula bookstore, along with all the other volumes in the series. If you're not into comic reading anymore, you can get the free PDF version when you join along as a Patreon backer for Scapula Comics. Join in at any level and you'll be sent the PDF version to follow along with. Super easy to do. I hope showing the creative process helps you out. If you're an artist yourself and you have questions for me, leave a comment below the video. I'm always happy to help you out. Counterculture was always something that I wanted to insert into the Scapula series. To me, it was a way to sort of separate Scapula from mainstream superhero comics. And Scapula Doubly Dark and Deadly was a big celebration of the countercultures that had inspired a lot of that other side of Scapula. There was goth culture and punk culture and metal culture and good old-fashioned rock and roll. I also wanted this to be a fun and exciting read, something that everyone can enjoy. How dark is it? How deadly is it? Well, you can decide for yourself, but either way, hopefully you'll have a good time. Let's dig right in. Alright, let's begin. First things first, open up your PDF if you're a Patreon backer. If you're a good old-fashioned tree killer kind of person, pick up the actual physical copy of the book, like a good reader should. And let's begin. So, here's our sort of old, sort of new cover. If you are a longtime Scapula reader, you probably remember the Dr. Caliban and the Sinister Monster Doom Legion semi-animated series here on this YouTube channel. I had tried to do a similar kind of series with Dio Sukari, but it never took off for a lot of different reasons. The artwork you're seeing here with all the Dios kind of like fanning out like that was a promo piece. So reduce, reuse, recycle, here it is again for your enjoyment. So, that's the cover, and let's go through. Sorry. Pardon me. Okay, page 1. Now, first of all, the title, Gemini's Copycat Counterattack. That is a very cumbersome title, not nearly as long as the last one, Giant Attack Monsters Thingamabobs. As I had mentioned with that title, that is sort of inspired by a lot of Japanese movies which have very lengthy titles that, you know, probably make sense in the original language, but when they're translated to English, they seem a little cumbersome. These titles here are also very much like, a lot of anime have episodes of like very lengthy titles, like, I don't know, Big Final Showdown, Goku Secretly Strikes Back, and stuff like that, you know, just, it's got a certain flair to it, it's got a rhythm to it, and I tried to capture that here with Gemini's Copycat Counterattack. And now, let's go to the lady of the hour herself, Gemini, here in her lab, checking in on some of her workers. Gemini has the dubious honor of being one of the most difficult characters for me. She's very difficult to draw because I'm trying to make both of the heads stay on model and look the same. She's difficult to write because writing a character who's smarter than you are is a bit of a challenge. And then, of course, there's her entire operation, not just the gangster angles of it, but also when she started investing in the duplication racket, which happened during the webcomic series. This got very long and complicated, and it confused some webcomic readers. It even confused me a lot of the times, too, because there was just so much to keep track of. So much so that when those of you guys who have the physical copy of Scapula Doubly Dark and Deadly will know that there is an entire 2-page spread dedicated entirely to just letting new readers know who Gemini is. You know, why does she have 2 heads? Why is she a gangster? What is her gang about? Why is she investing in duplication? Why does she not like Scapula? It's a lot to go into as compared to just Scapula and the Sinister Monsters, you know. You just throw them in a story, they're villains, you know what supervillains are after. With Gemini, though, it did get very lengthy and very complicated over the years. She still became kind of a fan favorite character. If it's weird. If you do a Google search for Scapula comic and do an image search, there is an entire tab that's dedicated just to Gemini, so I guess she has her fans out there. Gemini's partner in the duplication operation is a geneticist named Mira Anewa. Her name is a phonetic pun that I think was lost to a lot of the webcomic readers because when a Japanese name or a word is translated or romanized, sometimes the specific pronunciation is not quite clear. So Anewa read to a lot of American readers as Ainwa. Miramira's design, I guess, originated as sort of an homage to Kumi Mitsuno as Miss Namikawa in Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, or Invasion of Astro Monster. Back in the webcomic days, she just wore like a very simple like blue jumpsuit because I had to draw her again and again and again within each panel. But she's here now, and because I didn't have to draw her so many times, I kind of decided just go with a little bit more of an elaborate suit for her. It's a little more teched out, it feels more appropriate. She is here now spouting a little of exposition. Scientist characters are always good for exposition dumps. So not only is she telling you a bit about the duplication racket, in case if you're new, but she's also going to lead us into where our story's going, and that of course begins with a little bit of a callback. Something new in development that originated with a kaiju attack that happened recently. That of course would be giant attack monsters, and the corpse of an extraterrestrial cyborg that was spirited away by Gemini's operatives, that of course being Zarbanok. She has combined this with her duplication technology to create a new sort of nanobot. That is a whole lot of info to dump on people, and kind of like the last story, when you've got to just pile on a lot of exposition on the readers, the least you can do is throw in something with the art to kind of compensate for everything people have to slog through. So we have this kind of hologram, kind of a visual aid, and it's not, I guess, it's not really necessary to know what this nanobot looks like, but if it spells it out for readers and if it makes it a little more clear while also being visually more interesting than just talking heads left and right, then, you know, why the hell not? Let's jump to our next page. Miramira's ready to try it on a human subject. Allow me to introduce our test subject, Dio Sukri. Meow! This is going to be a long tangent. So if you gotta go to the bathroom, go right now, pause the video, come right back. This character's origins go as far back as the beginning of the Scapula series itself. Back in 2005 through 2007, as I was preparing a lot of character designs and sketches for this supervillain comic I had in the works, I had been developing lots and lots and lots of characters, and I'd say about 90% of them were axed out. This is where Scapula and the Sinister Monsters originated. One of the many concepts that I had developed was a character named Dead Ringer. Dead Ringer was a goth girl who had the powers of self-replication, pretty similar to Jamie Magic's The Multiple Man from Marvel Comics. The twist with her duplication powers were that she duplicated whenever she died. And because she was a suicidal character, and that's a very horrible and very untrue stereotype about goths, about the, constantly wanting to kill themselves. Her whole twist, as sick as this may be, was that she would commit suicide, but not only would she resurrect, she would come back as twice as many of her as before, and then she would just have to deal with all of her duplicates. It had possibilities, and she came pretty close to appearing in the very first Scapula comic. That is until I had made the decision that I didn't want fantasy or sci-fi elements, and I didn't want super-powered characters anymore. You can hear a lot of this in the commentary I did for the Scapula zine, the very first one from 2007. Dead Ringer was kind of a sad loss, but that was my decision at the time, and of course that was one I rescinded years later. But as for the multiplying character, for the time being, she was gone. Now, if Dead Ringer's design looks familiar, that's because the character design for her would be recycled years later as Bone China. And the duplication angle would sort of be incorporated into Mira when she finally appeared, although not as superpowers, but I had sort of lightened up on the science fiction angle by that point. And that's not even the end of it. Around 2011, while the Scapula webcomic was underway and starting to get some readers, I had sort of toyed with the idea of doing a sibling webcomic to go along with it. During this time, I was under the impression that Scapula would only appeal to male readers. I don't know why I thought that, because if you actually looked at the statistics and even like the comment section themselves, there were a lot of female readers for Scapula, but just, I don't know why, I just thought, well, if Scapula is only going to reach out to a male audience, maybe I can try to bring in a female audience or a larger female audience at long last by doing a comic that was much different in tone and much different in subject than Scapula. And so I came up with a really weird notion to try my hand at a teen romance comedy. That's a very odd decision for me, but it was, again, it was just wanting to experiment, wanting to try something new, and this is where the multiplying goth character came back into the fray. By this point, this character was going to be called Dioscuri. Dioscuri is another name for the Gemini astrological zodiac symbol, and this would have been very much along the line of like a Rumiko Takahashi manga, where, you know, lots of mix-ups, lots of bizarre things happening based around this teen with the power of self-replication and getting involved in all sorts of romantic hijinks and stuff like that, and so on, so on, so on. This did not come to pass basically for two reasons. Number one, in the commentary video I did for Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle, you guys will probably remember I remarked that I was not really all that familiar with anime. I don't have anything against it. There are some anime shows I like, but I don't feel as strong of a connection to anime as I would for other genres. I think if you're going to do a good genre work, so just for lack of a better term, it needs to be a genre you know inside and out. I'm able to do monster comics because if someone told me, can you do a Godzilla comic, a Frankenstein comic, something along those lines, I could do it because I know that material. A teen romance comedy manga is not something I felt like then or now I would have that strong of a familiarity with, other than just passing a passing interest. When you're not familiar with something, you sometimes resort to plagiarizing. So it would just be ripping someone off, but not only that, it would be ripping someone off without much familiarity, which means you're just copying surface details while underneath is just a whole lot of nothing. And that's where I decided this is probably not the way to go. The other reason, and this is the strange one, is due to character design. When I'm designing characters just in my sketchbook and with the intention of putting them in my comic, there are a lot of things that I consider sort of almost arbitrary. Those are things like gender, age, race, lots of little details like that. There are other comic creators where a character's race or gender will be a specific part of that character. And of course, in this day and age of television with wanting representation for everybody, it's almost like a checklist. With me though, both then and now, a lot of that just it's just going with your gut. A character will turn out the way a character does just for reasons that is really hard to explain. I just want to make a good character and tell good stories. You could ask, why is Scapula a white man? That's just the way the character came out, no real reason. But if a publisher or an editor or a studio came and asked me, could you make Scapula as a black woman? It would be like, I guess. I don't know, maybe. It's just... the character is what the character is just because that's just the way it felt proper in my gut, and that's really the best way I can explain it. Getting back to Dioscuri, there was no way that would apply because for the life of me, I could not decide whether or not this character worked better as a boy or a girl. And that sort of indecision sometimes happens with writing stories, but generally with a character design, after a few tries, I think I usually have a working idea of what I want a character to be. With Dioscuri, it just went back and forth. Depicting Dio as a boy or depicting Dio as a girl both had their advantages and disadvantages, both felt sort of right, and yet neither really felt finished. And I wish I could elaborate why. I wish I could pinpoint it down to a specific reason, but it's just... the character would not work either way, and I tried again and again and again, and you can see some of these character designs up here where it bounced back and forth a lot. And finally, in the end, it was just so much confusion that I was like, okay, I need to put this aside and just get back to Scapula. Years later, there was the decision to try to bring back Dio again. Even though the gender issue had not been resolved, I still had decided, well, if this character's not going to work on their own, maybe it's time to try to work it into Scapula. You can see this illustration right here with Scapula and the Sinister Monsters fighting a crowd of Dios. I think this was during the notion where I tried Dio as a boy. Before I made the decision to end the webcomic with Memento Mori, this would have been the story that followed, which would have introduced the Dioscuri character. This is was actually the very last illustration that was done with the Scapula characters in their webcomic design before I took a year off to beef up my drawing skills and came back to the comic with a whole new look. Even though I couldn't really write a teen romance comedy story, would a teen romance comedy character work if you threw it into Scapula? And that was such an odd decision. It started piquing some interest because it was so out there, and yet it's something felt like it was starting to gel. Taking a happy little character and throwing him into a world occupied by just supervillains and gangsters and monsters and stuff like that, it seems odd at first, but then when you think of the funny possibilities, it'd be like if you took Pikachu and you threw him into the Evil Dead series. Does it work or does it make sense? Not entirely, but you're gonna get something very strange and very funny, hopefully, and maybe something very memorable. And that's where I finally decided maybe it's time to try setting up Dioscuri against Scapula. Around this point, Dioscuri became Diosukuri to sort of tie in the Japanese influence that the character had from pretty early on, and it was time to finally move forward with this character. Regarding the gender issue, which had still not been resolved, no decision is a decision, and if I couldn't figure out the character's gender, then maybe it should stay that way. A bit of this was influence from George Harriman's comic Crazy Cat. Comics readers and historians have been debating for decades whether or not Crazy is a male character or a female character, and I think that's actually part of the enduring appeal of that character, is just sort of letting readers decide for themselves, and that's where I sort of decided, well, why not just let readers bring what they want to the table with this character? If you see Dio as male or female or both or neither, you're not wrong, and I think that resolution was the closest I came to being happy with this character. The other thing about playing with the gender was this was around the time when they and them began being used as acceptable pronouns for non-binary people. I had thought it was kind of odd referring to a person in the plural, but then when you realize if you're going to refer to anybody in the plural, it may as well be somebody with multiple man powers, and finally this character did start coming together. Getting Dio into the Scapula series was really difficult because before I had come up with the actual connection that Dio would have with Jemini and Mira, there was sort of the idea to almost just drop Dio in without any explanation to how they got their powers. Origin stories can either be really great or really time-consuming, and I think when origin stories become mandatory, that's when they really are a slog and hard to get through, and I just did not want to waste time coming up with a suitable origin to explain how this kid is able to duplicate themselves. This brings us to our very first deleted scene. This would have been thrown right in prior to the story, but I don't know if this would have been for the exact same story as Gemini's Copycat Counterattack, because again, this was just getting Dio in without any really thought as to how it happens. This is Dioscuri, that's the old spelling of the name before the Japanese angle. Dio is 20 years old. I think in the final version, Dio was made a little younger as a teenager. If you've read Greatest Freak Show of All, that story takes place a couple years after this one, but Dio was still not old enough to buy alcohol in America. Dio is bisexual. Quite a few Scapula characters seem to play for both teams, so to speak. Dio listens to all the music that you hate. Yes, even that band. I did that specifically because I don't know what young people listen to these days, and rather than just do some Google image search and come up with a reference that would be dated within the year, I just decided to just go with that obscure thing. And that also sounds a little funnier, just saying Dio listens to all the music that you hate, because young people have terrible taste in music. Not like us more experienced veterans, we know what we're doing. Whenever Dio dies, Dio resurrects as two identical duplicates, and that would have been done with like a very Looney Tunes kind of gag, just showing us Safe has fallen on that Dio in the previous panel, two Dios squirt right out. And if those two die, they resurrect as two more copies, two more than the one that just died. Got that? Involves math. So, in one friggin' panel, we've explained how Dio Powers works. Where Dio Powers came from? I don't know and I don't care, so we just decided, well, let's throw out a bunch of ideas. Nanobots, which would turn out to be the answer I went with eventually. Gypsy Curse. Mad Scientist, I'm pretty sure that's Dr. Forrester from Mystery Science Theater 3000. Aliens, Rod Serling, whatever. It didn't really matter to me at the time how Dio got their powers, just as long as they got their powers, get into the story and get it moving. But we still have one other aspect of Dio to address, and that is, of course, The gender ambiguity. Some dude shows up, says, "Yo, what's the deal with this weirdo? Is he a dude or a chick?" He seems to be thinking about waffles in the next panel for some reason. Waffles, I guess, is another Mystery Science Theater reference. Laying it on the table, Dio's gender is up to you. Whether Dio is a boy or a girl or both or neither is left for you to decide. That is something that has stayed with the character. Eventually, the nanobots and Jemini and Mira just made a bit more sense rather than just plopping a character down right in. Let's integrate it a little more smoothly. And that's how we led to Gemini's Copycat Counterattack. Mew, says the character. Everybody likes cats. And I think the mew was also sort of a holdover from a time when I had considered calling this character Copycat, because the character copies themselves. And we get a brief explanation that Dio Sukuri is Mira's sister's kid. We have a dialogue exchange here. I don't know if this is offensive or not, but I do like it a lot. Is Dio a boy or a girl? I don't remember. And honestly, I just think it's so odd that not only would Mira not know the gender of this kid, but especially after experimenting on the kid, which you would think would involve at least a physical, that she still doesn't know. So, whatever, it's sort of throwing logic out the window, but I like it still. We move along, and finally we listen to Dio speak properly, and oh boy, does this kid have a lot to say. A lot of chitter-chattering, including some references to the family. Oba Mira, which is Auntie Mira. Chi-Chi's in Osaka. Chi-Chi is a Japanese term of endearment for father. And Mutti, a German term of endearment for mother, is from Cologne. We are barely into the story, and we already have a bit of a continuity error. Dio has just said that their mother is German, even though in just the previous panel, we heard Mira say that Dio's mother is her sister, which would sort of imply that the mother is Japanese. Now, that's not entirely impossible. It could be said that Mira has a German sister who's adopted, and you know what? I'm the creator of this mess. I can change the continuity all I want, and we're gonna do a big retcon right now to fix this. Mira has a adopted German sister who is Dio's mommy. And just to make things more interesting, that German sister is none other than Griselda von Middendorf from the Dr. Caliban cartoon. Griselda went and married a Japanese guy, and they had Dio together. Then she went off on the dinosaur island where she encountered the sinister monsters. It all ties together, and even more so when you remember the fact that Griselda was killed by Nas. So that's doubly ironic. That's one Nazi killing another. And we're gonna see Nas figure into the story later, tied into our Dio character. It all works, okay? Mistake corrected. Okay, whew. That's a lot of time spent on this page, so let's pick up the pace and move on to the next one. Dio rambles on about just being impressed by...
Wow, Gemini's a gangster. This is so much fun. Oh, I like your other head.
I did not write Dio to be a stupid character, necessarily. I think Dio is just very naive, very hyperactive. Writing Dio is a lot like writing a puppy, where this character is just like fascinated with the world around them, and they want to zip around here and zip around there and say like, "Hi, what are you doing? What are you doing? Do you have food? Are you a gangster?" Gemini is not having it. You make your stupid pet do its stupid pet trick. Gemini, did you use it as a pronoun? But anyway, okay, it's time to see what this kid can do. Begin duplication. I went with colored backgrounds here, and you kind of notice the warmth of the color of the background gets warmer and warmer the harder Dio tries to use their powers, until finally when they're pooped out, it just goes to dark. Looks like there's a cheap fart joke in there. Huh. I could have sworn it worked on the lab chimp. Something about that line makes me think of an Eric Powell comic, or the kind of non sequitur he would use. I must have mentioned in one of these videos before that I'm a big fan of Eric Powell and the Goon, and they were both a big influence on myself and Scapula. Gemini pulls a gun on this kid. This could be a pretty bad situation, except for somehow Dio's making the most of it. One of the things I had really wanted to do with this Dio character was just show that they were just very positive and optimistic and happy at all times, even in a case where someone is pulling a gun on them, that they're still going to try to make friends and be the best of the situation and be positive about it, but that's not going to save you from a bullet in the head. Gemini just shot a queer kid in the head. Oh my goodness, cancel Gemini! Not that Gemini really cares, and as it turns out, Mira doesn't care either for very different reasons, because Mira mentions that Dio was half Shirojin. Shirojin is a Japanese term for a white person. Mira's just a little bit racist sometimes. Looks like Dio's not quite dead yet. All of a sudden, resurrection! Bloop! The Dio split into two with a very loud sound effect. If you're very old like I am, you probably remember playing a Nintendo, playing Super Mario Bros. 2, and you probably remember a character called Birdo. What a surprise, another gender-ambiguous Japanese character, who made a very specific sound whenever they spat out eggs. Something unique to go with Dio's replication powers. Sound effect association, I guess, think of like, I don't know, when Autobots transform, there's always very specific sounds that go with that, and it's just a little bit of something extra to bring to the character. Interesting! It appears death is the catalyst for duplication. Scientist characters and their exposition dumps, whatever. There is something that bugs me about this panel, and that is we have the two Dios looking at each other and getting the revelation for the first time as to what happened, but for some reason I drew one of the Dios with their back to the camera, and I think that was a big mistake because we're missing out on a whole nother reaction. This would have been a case where almost even using the exact same drawing, copied and flopped, so they're both looking at each other face to face and really sinking in that this person is just split into two, I think would have been better. So that's a mistake which really bugs me, and it bugs me so much that let's shoot this kid twice. We have a little throwaway dialogue here just to show like a timing beat. And all of a sudden, the Dios are back with bloop bloop. Let the Dio chitter chatter begin. They are all rambling off as these happy little if I wrote Dio as a puppy, you know what happens when you get a puppy together with a bunch of other puppies. It's gonna be the total loud chaos. One of the Dios mentions that if we make more, we could be on a volleyball team. That line was originally baseball team, which is a very quick, subtle little reference to Calvin and Hobbes and the scientific progress goes boink story, speaking of duplication tales. Why I changed it was for a very dumb reason. For some reason, I thought baseball was too gender specific and that would make make readers think that Dio was male. And I tried to pick a more gender ambiguous sport. Came up with volleyball, and that's really friggin' dumb because we all know men and women play baseball, we all know men and women play volleyball, so chalk that up to ignorance on my part, not just ignorance on gender, but ignorance on sports. Speaking of ignorance, looks like somebody's forgot to lock the front door, because uh-oh, here come the fuzz. The SWAT team has busted in, and leading the charge is a very old character named Inspector Farley. Farley goes way back, even before Scapula, to a high school comic book that I drew. He was eventually integrated into the Scapula series in the early webcomic years in an effort to try to have characters who weren't just supervillains and gangsters. But he never really quite took off. It just never really seemed to work. I think he was too far away from the main action of Scapula and the other villain characters that it just felt like time was being diverted away from them where it should be. Farley made only one very brief appearance in World's Worst Villain, and then from there on in, it was just tiny little cameos. This was pretty much just showing that the character was still alive, even if he hadn't been seen in a long time, and even if his wife was an insane child abductor, and even if his son had been brutally stabbed to death. Whatever, he's here, he's leading the SWAT team for some reason, and if that doesn't make a lot of sense, then here's something that's really nonsensical, and that's Gemini's reaction. For some reason, she seems to think that this is all a front by Russian mobsters pretending to be cops, and she goes on the attack. That seems like a really dumb thing to do for a character who's supposedly smarter than everyone else, and the only explanation I can have is just that Jemini, I guess, would be a very impulsive character, not entirely in control of her patience, and she's just gonna jump to the gun. And she goes on the attack, and she summons a security robot, and this is gonna bug the hell out of me. Now, those of you guys who watched the commentary video for Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle will remember the long rant I went on regarding Zarbanok and how a retro-style comic with a robot character who looked way too modern. This is the exact opposite problem. The horror influences in this story, if there are any, are a bit more modern. They would only go as far back as the 1980s. I'll talk about that in a bit. But definitely not as far back as this. This design really harkens back to the 50s or 60s, and even in particular, the B9 robot from Lost in Space. Something that's gonna roll around screaming like a Dalek. Annihilate! Annihilate! Well, she's jumped right into a battle for no reason with a bunch of crappy robots, and she's gonna get what she deserves. Here we have a big chaos panel. This is a much better chaos panel than the one in the previous Giant Monster story. Again, the chaos panels are a big homage to the original EC Mad comics and artists like Wally Wood and Bill Elder, and a lot of that chicken fat, cram as much in there possible. Away from the mess has scurried one Dio Sukari. And we move on to our next page. Dio goes running out of there. Car is pulled up. Dio climbs in, and what is inside? A really weird drawing mistake. One of Dio's arms, for some reason, is stretched out super long to like Reed Richards proportions. I should have caught that earlier, but man, that's a really dumb gaffe to leave in. Whatever, what's inside is, of course, another Gemini. Gemini is not just the president of the Duplication Association, she's also a client. Webcomic readers, of course, remember that there have been multiple Geminis over the years because she had duplicated herself many times to run her operations. Geminis popped up here and there, the most notable of which is the deviant goth Gemini. We'll be seeing more of her in a little bit. We have another Gemini taking the reins. She has a little bit more of a sci-fi superhero costume, for lack of a better word. Gemini quickly explains that Dio is carrying something very valuable, which is the nanobots, and she wants to keep a hold of this kid until they can be put to a better use. That explains why she's going to be sticking around with Dio for the remainder of the story. Dio throws out a phrase.
Oh, that's cool beans.
Oh boy, I first learned about this stupid phrase from a girl I had a crush on in college who used to say the phrase cool beans. I had not been familiar with that expression before. Very doofy, very cutesy, but again, cutesy and doofy seems to sum up Dio pretty well, so if they were going to try their hand at an American expression of cool beans seems just as good as any. And if you don't agree, then you've got company with Gemini who just tells the kid to shut up. As we jump to the next panel, we get a view of the chauffeur, and he's keeping a close eye on them. This is a guy named Molina. If he looks familiar, that's of course because he's modeled after actor Alfred Molina, who has more than established his supervillain credentials by playing Dr. Octopus in the Spider-Man movies. It looks like a pee break is in order, so let's move along to our next important development. Molina isn't just a chauffeur, Molina is a spy. And a spy for, that's right, our old friend Scapula. And this is very odd that we are 7 pages in and we've just finally gotten to the title character. Scapula with his old soldiers, the Halloween gang. Because we have the counterculture angle going on with this book, and since a lot of these kids were established as being angry punks and angry goths and the like, they seem to fit the tone pretty perfectly. If you have the print version, you'll know that there is a typo. This typo was removed from the digital version because it's a very dumb one. In the proper dialogue, Scapula says, "Tonight is going to be full of tricks and treats." In the printed version, Scapula says, "Tonight is going to full of tricks and treats." That's a stupid typo, and that's just what happens when you're a creator and you have to be your own editor, is sometimes mistakes slip through the cracks, they make it into print, and I bang my frickin' head when I see stuff like this in the book form. When future books came along, I sort of made a practice. Before the files went off to the printer, I would do something akin to an actor's table read, where I would read the entire book out loud just to catch typos like that. Did other typos make it through? Maybe a little less than before. Whatever, we have Scapula, we have the Halloween gang, and leading the Halloween gang is a very vocal character, which is, of course, Naz. Naz goes back to the webcomic years, and she had her own personal story in Doubly Dark and Deadly called Rock'em Knock'em Punks. Very impulsive, very over-emotional, and therefore she really sees Scapula as her idol. When we had last seen Naz in the webcomic, the implication had been that she was going to become his protege, or even his sidekick, if you imagine like a bastardized Batman and Robin, which could have been pretty funny. But even now that we're seeing her again after that time, and even after what we imply that he would take her under his wing, the emotional connection between Scapula and Naz never really clicked. We had known in the webcomic that Naz really adored Scapula, and how she really looked up to him, whether she saw him as a role model, a father figure, or even a crush. That's up to the reader to decide, but either way, she really was into him. Scapula, though, even though I had tried to give the idea that he would look out for this kid, it just never felt natural. There are a lot of times where characters sort of started writing themselves in the series. It's just the way these things flow, and whether or not characters would really have all that in common with each other. Sometimes it did work. Scapula and Naz are an example, Throgor and Toxic, Scapula and Deviant Gemini. But with Scapula and Naz, it never really made a lot of sense to me that Scapula would want to really connect with this kid. He seems to like her, of course. That pat on the head, I think, is his way of being friendly, of course, even though to someone of Naz's age, that seems really, really annoying. So she just sort of puts up with it with this really annoyed smirk. But of course, in the very next panel, she's going to be taking out her anger on a fellow Halloween gang member who's like a whole head taller than her and could probably bench press her. Uh-oh, big imposing silhouette with our gun pointed right at our poor unfortunate spy. But it turns out that gun isn't meant for Melina just yet. It's meant for her kid. Dio remarks about coconut or green tea flavor soda or Slurpee or whatever it is they're drinking. I used to go to a lot of Asian neighborhoods looking for Godzilla collectibles when I was young, and I do recall that a lot of the grocery stores around there would have very peculiar flavors to, I guess, American consumers, but they're probably really good in their own right. I don't know what coconut soda would taste like. Dio may be focused on their sugary drink right now, but it looks like they're looking down the barrel of a gun next. We have a beat and all these Dios pop out. I've got an army to build. How's that for an act break? We'll be right back with Act 2 after the music. Ladies and gentlemen, the Rhythm Coffin! I can't do this anymore.
Oh, that's better. I hate being pretty. I love being ugly.
Okay, let's continue with the commentary. We are in Act 2. Scapula and the Halloween gang approach the location that Melina the spy gave them, and along the way they're having a little bit of small talk. Right here, one of the Halloween gang members is just name-dropping some of the adversaries that Scapula has faced over the years. I did this just as a little bit of history and just as a little bit of a reminder that, this was 10 or 11 years into the Scapula comics. Some of the enemies being listed here are, of course, the major ones that Scapula faced back in the webcomic days. We have Sharkmouth, the Cleafoth of Dikabal, Knuckle Sam, and Zarbanok, who we just saw the last issue, of course. One of the odd ones mentioned here is Dada Man. Now, Dada Man, of course, is a long-running character going to before the Scapula comic and the Dada Hyena series. The fact that he's listed here as one of Scapula's enemies, I'm not entirely sure why I did that. Dada Man and Scapula had encountered each other once before in the webcomic. It was very brief, and Scapula wasn't really happy to see him, but that wasn't really like an enemy encounter. It wasn't like a fight or whatnot. A little bit after this, there was the story called Christie and Edgar, which did establish that a pre-supervillain Scapula had met Dada Man briefly through their mutual friend Christie, and I guess maybe he's not fond of Dada Man because it reminds him of Christie or just the company she kept. I don't know. That's a long and convoluted history. Either way, yeah, it could have been any of the other villains. Could have been the Dugong or the Miscreants or Seal Sakuro, but whatever, Dada Man's there, and you know what, I like Dada Man. Why does Jemini bother him more than the other enemies? Or he's going on complaining and then lets it slip, of course, that he does find her attractive. I usually don't like spelling out the character's motivations that blatantly, but I think at this point there's been more than enough evidence that Scapula has been interested, or at least in lust for Jemini, so letting a comment slip about the fact that he's into her butt is like, I don't think that's anything shocking or revelatory. And who doesn't like a nice butt? We are approaching inside, shadowy and ominous, and of course, poor old Melina, there he goes. Well, so long, buddy. You were really good in the Spider-Man movies. Jemini has figured out the plan, and she's got something horrifying for her enemy Scapula, and it is the Dio Sukuri kid.
Hi, I'm Dio!
Dio's name, of course, the weird Japanization of Dioscuri into Dio Sukuri. I knew sooner or later having a character named Dio was probably gonna draw comparisons to Ronnie James Dio, who was awesome but has nothing to do with this character or why Dio has the name that they have. So I figured before someone else points it out, I might as well beat them to the punch and just mention it myself in a very stupid throwaway gag. Scapula was going to say, yeah, and I'm Alice Cooper, of course, because, Scap's a big fan of Alice, I'm a big fan of Alice, but I think Alice Cooper has had more than enough free publicity in the Scapula series over the years. So I decided to go with another rock star. I think I had considered Meatloaf or Ozzy before I just hit on Blue Oyster Cult because it's such a specific name. It just made it seem funnier that way. Dio thinks it's funny even if the joke goes right over their heads.
I like your horns.
This profile shot, not only is it's kind of funny, just Scapula's blatant what the hell reaction, but you can kind of see Dio in profile, the side view of the body. It was very, very tricky designing a character who could be interpreted as male or female as the reader sees fit. And obviously that gets a little harder when you're describing the body. If you look at the contours of the chest, that's really the tricky part there. If you choose to see Dio as male, then it's sort of the contour of pectoral muscles. If you choose to see Dio as female, then she's a member of the Itty Bitty Titty Committee. Either way, it was a bit of a challenge, so hopefully it works here. Whatever you want Dio to be is what Dio is. And what Dio is, in Scapula's mind, is a little kid being babysat, which is not really too far off of a guess. Gemini, what the holy hell is this? Holy hell is a phrase I really like a lot. I think I probably overused it way too much in this series, but whatever, it makes me laugh. And the big reveal on the next page is there are more than enough Dios to go around. This is a pretty big warehouse, and honestly, I should have gone a lot further. There really should have been way more of the Diosukuri crowd than just this. You could see the rafters up in the factory. There just should have been a line of Dios just like hanging over the edge looking down. It's also kind of interesting that all the Dios were that quiet to make that sudden reveal work. You would think that they would all just be chattering nonstop in the darkness, which would have been a funny gag, but it breaks the reveal, so whatever. They're pretty quiet right now, too. They're just kind of standing around. I guess the answer is they're just being confused. Gemini gives the order, okay, kids, get them. To which nothing happens.
Get him what?
Guess what? Diosukuri can't fight, and you know what? Not everyone knows how to fight, and that's the weird thing about superhero and action comics is that everyone can fight, everyone can get in a battle. It doesn't even matter if they're a hero or a villain or not. It's just for some reason in comics everybody knows how to fight, when in actuality a lot of people probably would be kind of stuck as to what to do if you were told go get in a fight with somebody. It would probably just be like, why? Plus the fact that, Dio doesn't really have a mean bone in their body. Attack! Smash! Hurt! Kill! Cowardly Scapula was, of course, a very old trope, going way back to the beginning of the series, where Scapula was running away and screaming nonstop, very cartoony, very cheap gags. And even though I had really did what I could to move away from that over the years, it came back every now and then. Number one, when it's funny, and number two, because that's just Scapula. Speaking of people who aren't experts at getting into fights, there's nothing to be gained and there's a serious amount of damage that's at risk, then yeah, he's taken off. I don't blame him either. First thing tomorrow, you're all getting signed up for combat training. I would imagine that would have led to a montage. Gonna need a montage showing how the Dios learn how to fight, but even that would have been too much time wasted for a comic like this. So we're just gonna assume maybe maybe the combat training happens, maybe it doesn't. But a whole lot of chatter starts going on. We have a little Easter egg in here when they mention a claw fight with Mariko in the 5th grade. There was one of the regular webcomic readers back in the day was someone named Mariko. A lot of the webcomic readers who commented regularly and followed along and gave their support, I do remember them a lot, and I tried to slip in some of their names every now and then. We'll be talking about another one later. Maybe it'll be you. Moving on, and we do have a montage. It's not a training montage, but it's a little bit of just setting up the Dio army that is now under Gemini's command. This is one of the very few instances in the comic where I did have to resort to copy and paste, and I really didn't want to do that, even though it's a pain in the ass to draw a multiplying character again and again. It still feels a lot like cheating. I think my justification is that this is not a literal shot going on right now. The Dios aren't standing in a room that looks like hell, and there's not a gigantic black shadowy Gemini looming over them, as interesting as that would be. Right now we're just establishing that, yep, she's got an army to command, and even though they may be a bunch of little twerps, they still have power to them, and what exactly that power leads to is implied endless encounters where they're weeding off the Halloween gang. Now, how these scenes actually play out is, maybe you could say it is a little bit of information missing, because what exactly the DOs are doing when they're just being sent to a location is not entirely made certain, and how it plays out is just a DO shows up, presumably just annoys the hell out of them when they're in the middle of their heist. The killing starts, and then finally everybody's tired and goes home, or the cops show up and pick them all off, which is a very strange strategy to say the least, but when you have an endless supply of disposable soldiers, that's got to be worth something, even if their power is just being cheery and annoying. Either way, the Halloween gang's not having it. And another group of monstrous characters who are not having it is our old buddies, the Sinister Monster Doom Legion. When last we saw these guys, of course, was in Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle, and they had all been sent off to jail. Why they're here now, instead of rotting away in a prison, is just for the simple fact that I love the Sinister Monsters. They're really some of my favorite characters to write and draw in the Scapula series, and even though I was taking a break from them in this book to focus on other characters, both old and new, I would have been really sad if they did not make any appearance in the book whatsoever. We have here this big action scene. This is a little bit of a recreation of that Dio vs. Sinister Monster older piece that I had shown earlier. Hypnasia is probably the scariest one in this scene when you consider the age difference between these two. That's pretty creepy. Throgor has a weird scale issue going on. Not scales on the body, but a weird just how big Throgor is compared to these kids. Like a lot of giant characters in comics, like the Hulk or the Thing, his size always seems to jump around depending on the needs of the artist. And right here, my god, he looks like Mighty Joe Young throwing these kids around. Who's not having a lot of fun? Well, Jemini. Oh boy, dealing with these kids and their chattering. Now, Dio's dialogue is full of a lot of non sequiturs and a lot of cheeriness and a lot of energy, and longtime Scapula readers are probably getting a little bit of deja vu because there was a very similar character, the Mooney Meadows, the hippie Wiccan nudist stoner who dated Scapula back in World's Worst Villain. I was a little worried at first that it was recycling too much of the character, because they do have similarities. They're very cheery, they're very positive, they make the best of any situation, and they seem to be oblivious to danger. The difference between Dio Sukuri and Mooney Meadows, in my opinion, is that Mooney Meadows is a bit more of a selfish character, and I don't mean selfish as in the outright greedy sort of way, but she definitely lives for hedonism and self-indulgence or whatnot. You can even see back then, she didn't treat her, she was nice to her boyfriends and her roommate and her kids, but for the most part, she was just interested in whatever was going to please or excite her next. Dio is definitely more interested in the world and the people around them, even if they have no sense of they don't have any good judge of character, judging by the fact that, they're working with gangsters, even though they have no criminal aspirations whatsoever. Who knows? And maybe they even think they're being helpful to their boss, Miss Gemini. A lot of the aspects of Gemini's duplication racket were expanded as much as I could. The deviant Gemini was really the first Gemini to find her own personality. Back then, it was sort of implied that that's because of Scapula's influence. Maybe Geminis are just influenced by whatever environment they're in. First of all, there is our good old buddy, Deviant Gemini herself. This was originally going to be her only appearance in this book, just a cameo, but then along came the Dominion story, and we'll be talking about that later. The other two ones we're seeing is Hong Gemini. Look out, internet, white person taking somebody else's culture. And sort of along those lines is the Scarface Gemini. I probably should have gone with the Clockwork Orange Gemini. Getting back to our current Gemini, Dio just sort of blathers out,
Isn't there a big boss Gemini? A mama Gemini?
perhaps there is. She's getting on the phone and reopening Project Ravana. Ravana is from the Ramayana, usually depicted as having multiple heads, so of course that would be of interest to Gemini. Meanwhile, the Halloween gang are driving around. What are they going to get? More soldiers, more firepower, another robot dinosaur? Well, Scapula says we don't have the finances for any of that. My Cabal funds have been cut off, likely due to that Two-Faced Pig's manipulations. This was finally addressing a bit of continuity that had been left untouched since the webcomic ended. Those of you guys who remember Memento Mori know that it ended with Scapula a rich man. He had access to funds of this secret society, and even though he did have to share them with Deviant Gemini, the implication is still that he was getting a lot of money from it. This was not really addressed in the book that followed after, Sinister Monster Doom Legion. This was finally saying, okay, Scapula, too rich and too powerful Scapula really is not all that interesting. So I decided to sort of write that off with just that throwaway line saying that, you know, Gemini would have cut it off. This was expanded more years later in a story called The Last Words of Bone China, which is collected in Bone Chilling Tales of Scapula, which makes it a little more clear what happened to Decabal's money and why Scapula's not rich anymore, why he's riding around in a junky old van. Or maybe not that junky. It's got a pretty cool decal on the side, even though you can't really see it from this angle. The actual artwork seen here was an old piece I did of a robot monster drawn in the style of Ed Big Daddy Roth, who is, of course, an icon to all of us monster kids. Whatever, we got more important things to worry about. So, an innocent life has just been struck down and killed, but don't worry, there's a couple more to spare after that resurrection. Our Frankenstein guy says, I thought I saw a girl out there, or maybe it was a boy, just another reminder of blurring the lines of gender. Back to the Dios, they're having their conversation, and
I don't care how many times it happens, dying hurts a lot.
but Dio seems to make the most of it. I don't know how I would react to being killed and resurrected, but probably not with this much optimism. You know who's not optimistic? Scapula grabs Dio and says, you pasty little fruits have been wiping out my entire gang. It's a pretty homophobic slur he's throwing up. As we've known of Scapula before, and as we'll be seeing again later, he's not above insensitive comments. Dio's language isn't that much better either.
Scheiße!
I think that says Scheiße. I just grabbed that off the internet. To my German readers out there, you can correct that if that's wrong. If it is, sorry. Another beating begins, or an implied beating. I don't think anybody wants to see Scapula actually punching this kid. Not that the other Dio has that much on the mind, because they've seen something that's grabbed their attention, and it's Nas. Love and crushes is something that I really had wanted to do in Scapula for the longest time. And I mean like really heartfelt, young love crushes. We've had relationships in Scapula before, but they were always definitely more of an older vein. But I mean just like a huge high school level crush. That's something I always wanted to do with the series, but it never really worked out because Scapula himself was way too bitter, cynical, and world-weary. But something like this, something more innocent, something funnier, it was about time to get this in there. Not that Nas agrees, but Dio, very cartoony gag, breaking laws of physics, more non-sequitur jibber-jabbering. Although in this case, that's actually a little more realistic. Nas isn't having it, of course, and while Dio chatters on and on, she has armed herself. We've known, since at least the Memento Mori storyline, that Nas is a murderer and will resort to fatal violence for even the smallest of provocations. That murder violence, at this time, thankfully, is going to be off camera. Stab! Bloop! I think originally there was going to be a reaction comment from the Frankenstein guy or the Wolfman guy where they were just going to say like, dude, or whoa. I left it out because it's not necessary. And besides, there's going to be a lot more talking in a moment because now we got two Dios chatting off Nas's ears. This drawing of Nas it's a little bit of a mean reference. Nas had a lot of inspirations, but one of the main inspirations for Nas was Fairuza Balk in films such as The Craft. Fairuza Balk has a very distinct smile. It's very toothy and very gummy. She shows a lot of them when she's got this big smile on her face. Definitely see her in The Craft, and a lot of that is parodied here. If that hurts her feelings, I have a very small Fairuza Balk story. She walked by a convention table of mine one time. She didn't say anything, she just had this look. And just walked on by. Okay, moving along. Scapula has an idea. That's a very silly face on Scapula, but every now and then, even in the middle of a serious story, I do like to go for a quick gag. Here's Scapula being devious, as he really should be, because he knows these little brats could potentially give him what he wants. He's got some bait, and if the kid plays along, maybe everyone will get what they want. And hopefully what they want is some better catchphrases than super cool beans. Shut up. Where is Dio gonna lead them? Well, to a potentially pretty cool hideout. It's in a cemetery. Damnation, I should have done that. And he really should have too. I can't believe there had not been any stories where Scapula had set up a lair in a cemetery. In fact, cemeteries really should have appeared a lot more often in a goth wannabe comic like this one. I tried to make this very foggy, and it's a color effect that's a little more obvious in the digital version because sadly a lot of subtle color effects when they go to print they get lost. So if you're reading the printed book version, the sky looks a little darker or muddier than it should, but in the digital version you're looking at now, the fog has a bit more definition. I really, really love fog, being an old San Francisco boy myself, and trying to capture a lot of that here is it was tricky to do, and hopefully it works, but whatever, we got more important things to focus on, such as that creepy looking crypt. They're going on inside, and wow, that's a big tomb that Dio's climbing into. I mean, look at the size of that thing. That was... Man, it must have been like a very famous rhinoceros buried in there. But of course, it's not actually used to hold a body at all. It's a stairway down some stairs with some very wonky perspective. Drawing backgrounds. Ugh. Where are they going? What's behind that door? We got a deleted scene. The very first version of the story, what's in the hallway are zombie clones. It's been established, I think, earlier on that Mira Mira and her technology can only duplicate living people. As for what happens when you clone a dead body, probably some freaky ass stuff. Probably along the lines of Herbert West Reanimator. It's not going to be pleasant. And what was originally going to be in the hallway was zombie clones of a lot of dead members of Gemini's gang. Now, a lot of these were just nondescript gangsters and members of Gemini's crew from forever ago. But one member of that gang would definitely have been recognizable, as we see in the second page here. The biggest and most dangerous zombie clone of all is Knuckle Sam. She was going to be amongst the zombie clones, and there may have even been a version where all of the clones were Knuckle Sam clones. It would have been like a whole stampede of them, and holy crap, I don't know what you would have done against something like that other than pray for a very, very quick death. That would have been pretty cool. I would have liked it. A lot of old readers would have liked it, but I think it may have been calling upon a little bit too much continuity, and that's something I obviously wanted to keep to a bare minimum with these one-shot books. So Knuckle Sam and all the Knuckle Sams went bye-bye, and I think another reason why I did it too was just sort of the rule about not bringing dead characters back to life, just because it kind of cheapens the deaths when you start resorting to that. Getting back to what is going to be encountered in there, well, we have the Gemini monsters. So designing the monster versions of Scapula and the Sinister Monster Doom Legion in the previous book was so much fun that I was like, oh, I want to do this again. And this time it's with Gemini and the different variations you can make with her. Now these are very different kinds of monsters though. Those versions, like with the Sinister Monsters in the last book, were more in the vein of Ray Harryhausen and Ajit Subaraya, the classic monsters like that from like 50s and 60s and whatnot. A lot of the flavor of this book, though, was moving forward, I think as I had mentioned earlier with the robot guards. And these ones are a bit more of the more gruesome Clive Barker, David Cronenberg, those kind of, the nasty, gross-out monsters of 1980s horror movies, which are still some of the sickest films. You could especially see the skinless snake Gemini is very nasty, especially with all the guts showing. Now, what isn't showing on any of these is, you'll notice, none of them have nipples.
I would like, if I may, to talk about boobs.
So, censorship. This has been a very long and frequent battle I've had, and if you support Scapula Comics on Patreon, you've known for a very, very long time the battles I've had over whether or not content is inappropriate or not. The Geminis are naked, and obviously we're not going to put bras on giant monsters, as funny as that may be, and I went back and forth about whether or not they should have nipples on the breasts, because biologically they would. These Gemini clones may be snakes or spiders or whatnot, but they still have memories, and memories would still have nipples. But of course that brings up the whole topic about whether or not the human body is something that's appropriate to be seen. Now, all of these books, they cost money to print, so I didn't know whether or not it was worth the gamble to invest all this money on something that could potentially be labeled as mature content or adult content or, God forbid, pornographic content. And that's where I think a lot of that indecision came from. Years later, there was a Dr. Caliban story where for some reason one Gemini monster has been included in the Sinister Monster Doom Legion. And since that story had originated as a Patreon exclusive, I decided, what the heck, I don't need to censor myself here. This page has already been slammed with the 18+ label forever and ever. For the sake of this story here, yes, the nipples were removed, and maybe someday, hashtag release the nipple cut of Scapula, Doubly Dark and Deadly. In the end, I decided to play it safe, but it's something that's always really bugged me about why breasts should be censored or why the whole taboo about this is. Please forgive the squeamishness, please forgive the fact that I gave into censorship. So there you go, someday we'll be able to show boobs. And more butts. And more hips. I'm kind of into hips.
Oh, and the tummy. The tummies are really nice. I like to stroke the tummies. Oh, thighs are really nice too. You ever like, oh, you know what I'm really into? You know what's really, really hot to do is when you take the arm and just kind of stroke it down right there. Oh my God, it's so good.
Looks like we got a fight on our hands. That fight being Nas versus Dio, but we got more important things to worry about than that. We also see another Gemini jumping into the frame. This is a really weird design. This thing is so damn goofy, even if it only appears in one panel, I gotta throw it in. This is a manji Gemini, not a swastika Gemini, because a swastika and a manji are very different, because a swastika is on its axis. That sucked. Scapula is opening fire. Here is a sight that has not been too often in this comic. Scapula fighting. Like I had been mentioning with Cowardly Screaming Scapula earlier, Scapula getting into fights was something I'd never really wanted to do because, again, he's not a fighter. He's a schemer, but as far as fisticuffs go, he definitely is not in that class. I think that suits him very well. That suits the character. In this case, though, I just figured he's got to get involved. I think the earlier version, he held back and let the Halloween gang do the fighting for him. Getting the balance right between funny, klutzy, cowardly Scapula and a competent Scapula, but not an ass kicker. One of the big inspirations to kind of have him have his occasional moment of battling and bravado was the Ash vs. Evil Dead series. If you know the Evil Dead and you know Ash Williams and that character, he is the perfect balance between an ass kicker and an ass clown. The series perfectly balances those two aspects, and I got a little inspired to say, okay, Scapula can look like a moron a lot of times, he can even look like he can be the screaming wimp, but every once in a while, give the readers a little bit of what they want, which is seeing a competent villain. A little bit of the cowardly Scapula is creeping through, just with a teeny tiny throwaway line, please, Jesus, don't let this abomination kill me, and he also takes a hit, just to show that, you know, this is not going to be a flawless victory. Not doing as well are the Halloween gang versus the Centipede Gemini. This took forever to draw. Now, what's more silly is this stupid little thing attacking. This is Troll Gemini. This is another stupid little sketch that I'm like, okay, this is so dumb, it's gotta go in there. Now, if you OCD like I do, the fact that this is the only Gemini that doesn't have bilateral symmetry is going to drive you nuts, because I had to decide which way the hair was gonna flip, to the left or to the right, and it probably could have been both, but that wouldn't have looked like Gemini so much, and believe me, that's gonna drive me crazy. And get back to just fun, mindless violence. Their efforts to make friends at the thing don't pair off very well because gobble. There are a few things in nature as creepy as seeing a snake eat something, so I tried to capture that here. And if you're an Alice Cooper fan, you'll love snakes, of course, but even still, seeing them eat something is kind of creepy as hell. What's going to happen next is even creepier than that, where we have the I wanted to make the Gemini faces a bit sillier, even when we have just this big splatter, gross out fest, blood and guts and glop and barf everywhere. And if you've never been to a gore show, definitely go to one, because getting hit with that stuff is a lot of fun. Getting back to Scapula, his suit's been torn to shreds, he's taken a beating, he's covered in blood. And Dio, as you can see, there's quite a few Dios, but not as many as there should be, as with that last panel we saw would have implied that there's, I don't know, gotta be something like 4 dozen Dios in the room right now, and they just kind of sort of disappear. I don't know. Okay, now that we've gotten past that obstacle and those mini bosses, it's time to go to the next level. We have a little dialogue exchange that I actually do like a lot. Now, writing dialogue is kind of hit and miss with me. Sometimes it's just filling in stuff, and sometimes I do actually have specific sequences in mind. This dialogue is one of the rare instances where I did have this in mind when I sketched out the thumbnails, and this exact stupid, silly conversation was almost word for word exactly as I had thought of it in the thumbnail stages.
Hi! Hi! Who's there? Dio! Who am I talking to? Dio? Hi, Dio! Hi, Dio!
Open the damn door!
Open the damn door! Okay!
It's not wordplay worthy of Abbott and Costello, but it's about as good as this comic gets. What's inside there? What is it? It's the next music break! Ooh, whew. Okay, coming down. Okay, we are on Act 3. We have entered Gemini's secret lab, and what a lab it is. Anything you can do to make a setting look visually interesting, because drawing backgrounds isn't always fun, but it shouldn't be boring. So in this case, I went all out with the colors. I may not be crazy about drawing machinery, but I do like coloring. This was sort of inspired by, I guess, nightclubs or synthwave albums, stuff like that. I sort of had like a Perturbator album in mind. I don't know how, maybe that applies to this, maybe it doesn't. This big reveal of this coffin was going to be a full page. It was like the, you know, taking up the entire thing. I didn't do that just to conserve space, and also just because, you know, it's not so much the casket itself, it's what's in it. That sounds very deep, except we're talking about a friggin' casket with a monster in it, spoilers. So I just condensed it down to just a fourth of the page.
Hi, guys.
This is Dio.
Damn it, Dio!
That's kind of funny. Anyway, Scapula and the crew come barging in. She's got a secret weapon she's gonna unleash. Opening the big gate, and it goes... Opening a big gate, and a big Kong, of course, is a reference to one of my favorite monster movies of all time, King Kong. It comes crawling out, covered in viscous fluids and nasty stuff. Again, 80s horror theme. Gross out is the name of the game. Speaking of gross, here it is, or maybe it's not gross, depending on what you're into. Here is the big reveal at last of Jemini. Is she horrifying? Is she beautiful? Again, depends what you're into. I'm not going to judge you either way, but it is kind of interesting mentioning the beauty angle, because... as, let's see here with this thumbnail here, the very first version of Jemini didn't look like this. Jemini was originally modeled after a Hindi god with, you know, multiple arms and the faces going around the head. Like Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu, Dormammu, I'm not a theologian, but it's something a little more along those lines, and she was also not quite this big. But of course, the name of the game with me is monsters, so I decided to skip the Indian mythology and go with Greek mythology, and in this case the inspiration came from one of the coolest Greek monsters ever, the Hydra. Always a bitch to bring to life, because obviously something with that many heads is gonna be like painful to draw, painful to animate, painful to design. You think Harryhausen had a tough time? His Hydra had 7 heads, mine has 8, even though I know a real Hydra has 9, who cares? Project Ravana lives. I guess Ravana would have been a little more appropriate if it had been Indian themed, but too late now. Next page. Should we shoot the thing? For the love of God, yes, shoot it! Not a good idea, because vroom, 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 Gemini, big surprise, has psychic powers. Big boom, boom, scanner style. There goes 2 of the Halloween gang members, and yeah, that's the death of the Frankenstein mask guy. He had been sort of a visual staple of the group for the longest time. I say visual staple, not character staple, because I don't think he was ever identified without his mask. Yeah, this is his death. Even when the Halloween gang struck again, and greatest freak show of all, he was not among the crew, because when you die, you stay dead in this comic. Usually. Anyway, heads blow up, and here comes the psychic powers, levitating Scapula and Nas into the air. To the extent that Gemini's powers go, I don't know. It's got 8 heads, so presumably it's strong, even though it's just kind of lifting them off the ground. Didn't have any mind how strong this thing's powers would be when I made this comic. It's not quite like at Tetsuo Shima levels of psychic energy, but it's good enough to get the job done, good enough to be a threat. You can insert the Akira soundtrack if you want to. Okay, I've got your bony balls in a vice grip. Bony balls? There's gotta be a band by that name. The hand lifts up, and big surprise, Gemini is caught off guard by her supreme powerful thing. If you look closely at the Gemini's hand, you can kind of see it sort of has some scaly texture to it. I wasn't quite sure how monstrous to go with this thing, if it should be like really gross, or if it should just look like a, you know, big round naked woman. I think I went with a little more on the monster angle just to make sure this comic didn't get pegged adult. Yeah, because horrible, disgusting monsters, that's a-okay for people of all ages, but the human body naked? Cover your eyes, kids. Here we have Scapula and Gemini are being lifted in the air, and we get a little bit of that bickering rapport that goes back to like the very earliest appearances of Scapula and Gemini together. They're enemies, of course, but it's also a little bit of little boys and little girls arguing just how immature they are. They go on bickering, but big surprise, it turns out not only does Gemini not like the little Gemini or the little Scapula, it doesn't like them arguing, because as we're going to find out in the next panel, guess she doesn't like negative thoughts, and I don't know who does. We get here some very, very over-the-top, wacky, cartoony expressions. And this is really cartoony stuff. Some of these expressions look like they may have been inspired by, like, Rocco's Modern Life or a lot of the Nicktoons I grew up with. They are floating up in the air. They are still bickering even while they're in the grip of doom. Why is Dio not caught up there? Probably because this thing isn't paying attention to them just yet. Is Dio gonna save the day? I guess they're gonna have to, because again, Dio is probably the closest thing the story has to a good guy or a good gal type. I don't know. I had never wanted to show Dio negative or angry or anything like that. So now when they've mustered up all of their fury, the only way their anger can manifest itself is with the most pathetic little stamp. And how pathetic is it? It's littered with Comic Sans. That's how pathetic it is. And don't remind me of the first year and a half or so of the webcomic when Comic Sans was used everywhere. Dio enacts their plan.
Why, hi there! You must be Gemini, or another Gemini! Ha 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 ha!
There's a very cartoony pose here on Dio, you know, just very rubber hosey. It might even be a little bit R-Crumb, keep on trucking kind of thing. It's just very silly, just showing that even Dio's big plan to save the love of their life is still pretty goddamn ridiculous. Next page. And of course, bloop, Dio starts blathering on, as Dios tend to do.
I saw this one guy online who could bend a KFC spork with his brain.
That's a reference, or sort of a reference, to this phony baloney psychic who claimed that he could bend spoons with his mind. He was pretty full of crap, so much so that he sued Nintendo over claiming that a Pokemon, the psychic powers they designed, was a copyright infringement on his trademarked ability to bend spoons with his brain. You can look it up online if you want to. I'm not going to mention him by name because I don't want to get sued either. Boom, boom, back at it, and bloop, bloop. I think you guys can see where this is going.
Did you know that you're naked? I wish I had the kind of confidence to just go around nude and stuff.
I have known quite a bit of people who had the confidence to just walk around naked. I'm not one of them. Don't worry, everyone out there. I'm keeping all this on for the sake of this video. And the blathering continues. Big action panel, just showing what you know is coming. Death, resurrection, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This is sort of one camera shot, so to speak, but it's divided into a triptych just to show the progress of, you know, the increased amount of explosions, the increased amount of more Dios, and escalating, boom, 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 and another Mew. And here we go with the great big reveal of the maximum amount of Dios in this comic. This is also one of the few instances where I did have to resort to a little bit of copying, pasting a drawing. If you look at the crowd of Dios furthest away from the camera and closest to the side Gemini, that's about, I want to say about 3 or 4 drawings of Dio that were just kind of repeated, just because I had to at this point because there's so many. All those other Dios in the foreground, though, those were all drawn one at a time, and oh boy, I hope you guys appreciate that. Gemini and Scapula are coming floating down. Again, the extent of this thing's powers is hard to gauge, but it's enough to yo-yo them up and down. They're not quite off the hook yet because more and more Dios are filling up the room. I'm gonna presume the crowd is blocking off the exit, which is why Scapula and Gemini don't just run out the door. That's not a plot hole. And we have just more Dios coming. This is yet another case where it's not copy and paste, it's a drawing I did and used it as a guide to make sure that all the Dios in the scene stay on model, so it's a little bit like just stenciling it. Finally, Gemini and Scapula reluctantly decide to work together. They open fire, and here's the thing about firearms. Now And actually, here's the thing about the side Gemini. I've been going on saying I don't know the extent of this thing's power, even though I wrote the damn story. But I'm also not quite sure, how strong would this thing be if a simple handheld gun could fire with enough impact, enough power to crush right through the brain, right through the lobe or whatnot. I don't really know. I don't know if you shot something like this at some sort of megafauna like an elephant or whatnot, would it penetrate the skull? I don't know. I didn't think about that sort of thing, but it's times like this where I really miss one of my webcomic readers named Lady Jen. If you guys were reading Scapula back in the webcomic days and you were leaving comments, you definitely remember the presence of a very fascinating woman named Lady Jen. Jen knew all this knowledge about firearms and violence and how to kill a person. And she would relate these things in a very friendly way, in a way that promoted open discussion, and never in like a boastful, bragful way, or never in like a hateful, misanthropic way. She just knew about these kind of things because I think she was a bodyguard. Jen, alas, died way too young and way too soon, and pretty much every Scapula book that ever came out after her passing was dedicated to her memory. And speaking of big, powerful women who died way too soon, this is the end of Jemini. However strong those bullets may have been, they were enough to put holes in quite a few of her heads. Not all of them. You can see kind of that little touch there where some of the heads are intact, which is going to be pretty horrifying to go through. As this entire thing, not only did the bullets puncture the brain, it caused the entire body to fall over backwards. Again, I'm just the guy who wrote and drew this thing. I don't know how the physics of a creature this large works, but whatever, it's enough to do the job, and rather than have this fight go on forever and ever, let's just say, okay, good enough. Gemini crashes into this thing. Some pretty fun poses I kind of like here. This one with the blue panel might be a little, the pose might be a little too faded because I went with light blue inks, but I like the way that pose turned out, and if you're familiar with my art, you know I've done more than enough drawings of big, beautiful women to know how those sort of poses work. Scapula Comics and Patreon, get to see figure drawings. You can see the electricity has started to hit the Dios, and their Achilles heel has been revealed. We see the big just silly sound effects. I didn't want this scene to be like too gruesome or whatnot because you don't want to feel bad for the Dios. It's just about to be like a mass killing of them, and going too grim or too sad with it is not the idea. So I just want very cartoony sound effects like popcorn or a string of firecrackers popping off. This entire crowd is wiped out in the least gory way possible, even though you can sort of see the inside of that one Dio's head. But it gets rid of the crowd, it solves the problem, and next thing you know, all these Dios have been reduced to a big pile of kind of silicone sand or whatever. Lovely. Mira, who is presumably been hiding in the corner the whole time. I don't know where the hell she was during all this. Probably doing the smart thing and staying out of trouble, is going to come along and explain exactly what happened. When the Gemini clone fell into the machine, caused a massive the electricity. The resulting EMP must have fried the nanites and Dio's cellular structure, causing a complete disintegration. That is such exposition, even Scapula's got to call it, but got to call that out. I hate it when I have to spell things out for the audience, but you know, sometimes you gotta make things a little crystal clear. It's probably one of my favorite drawings of Mira I've ever done. She actually looks kind of human here because she doesn't have that big crap-eating smile on her face that she always has. Everything has gone to pot and Gemini is not happy. Her big expensive operation has gone up in flames, her big clone is dead, her hated enemy is still alive, even though all she can do is call out an empty threat to him. And Scapula and Nas don't really feel like attacking Gemini with their bare hands, probably because they're tired and they want to go home and grab a shower and get some sleep. And as they head off, Gemini can only watch in anger as she vows vengeance. On the plus side, at least we don't have to worry about the annoying kid again. Punchline in 3, 2, 1, boop! Looks like there was one Dio left. You'd think she'd be happy that there's like one last relic of the nanite left, but we've had an entire story just showing how annoyed she is with this friggin' kid. I'm just gonna kill you! Some fun expressions right here. This is always the fun with Gemini, is when she's got two expressions going on at once. I've got an army to rebuild. And here we go with the most cliched, stupidest line to end a comic.
Here we go again!
And that is a stupid line, but it fits. That's the thing. It fits, as corny and stupid of an ending this may be. But it opens the door for another tale of Gemini and Dio and Scapula and all the others. And that's the end of that story. Aww, the noodle incident. Oh! We're not done? Oh, jeez. Okay. Yeah, I guess we're not done yet. We have a couple more things to show. Deleted scenes. Now, this is going back to the Gemini that we had talked about earlier, the one who wasn't quite as big or multi-headed as the Hydra one that came in. This is also before the idea came to electrocute the crowd of Dios out of existence. So this is picking up where Gemini and Scapula have teamed up to shoot the thing dead, but we still have an entire crowd of Dios, the ones that had annoyed her into submission, standing around. Scapula and Gemini, of course, are not really happy with the way things have turned out, and not only that, they are going to turn into fighting parents battling over custody of their kid. Scapula wants to take the Dio, saying that he had helped them out. Gemini, of course, says that the Dios belong to her because it's her nanites, her technology. Who's Dio going to go with, the bad dad or the bad mom? Well, turns out Dio's not going to go with either of them. They just flat out say, I quit. And that's the end of Dio's reign of crime. Scapula and Gemini are still bickering while Dio finally gets to ask Nas out on a date. That's just an okay ending. I mean, we can do better than okay, though, and what we went with was probably a lot better than something like this. I've shown a lot of deleted scenes before that are, like, embarrassingly bad or really dumb or a little bit of both, and that's why they obviously get thrown out. This here is easily the stupidest, most embarrassing sequence I've ever drawn in most any Scapula comic. So let's talk about Godzilla. When it comes to Godzilla movies, the two that are tied for the best ending shot right before the credits hit is Godzilla King of the Monsters, which has all the Titans bowing down to their new king, and equally cool in a very different way is Shin Godzilla, which has a very skin-peelingly creepy shot of the humanoid Godzilla creatures emerging from his tail. It freezes your blood, so of course I had to bastardize it and swipe it with this very, very stupid tagged-on thing here, where it reveals that the Psy Gemini has, Gemini clones growing out of her butt. Oh. There is no fewer than 800,000 reasons why this freaking page does not work, and rather than going into them, let's just put this away and forget it ever happened. And let's move on to something a little bit better. Actually, much better than that. We have an epilogue. Shortly after the events of the story, if you're reading the PDF, you can see it here. There is no dialogue, but the dialogue gets a little bit filled in a moment. You'll see what I mean. Back at the Wax Museum, Scapula has gathered up a handful of the Diosukuri silicone under the belief that, well, it's got to have some value. And the Wax Museum has been lit with candles. He's got a coffin in the background, he's muttering something, and as he looks up, we reveal the preserved body of Bone China. Pretty much how the fate of Bone China, spoilers from the Memento Mori comic. Scapula has preserved her, Scapula cradles the body, and in a very, non-sick, non-creepy, not eerie, obsessive kind of way, strokes her and says, "Yes, my dear, the dead will walk again soon." That's actually not a bad page at all. It does, and it would have set up a lot of what happens in Greatest Freak Show of All. The problem with it is just simply, well, the problem first and foremost is, like a lot of artists, I don't know when to call something done, because I took this sequence and expanded it because I felt good enough about it that I thought, well, what would be even better than one page of this? Let's blow it up and make 2 pages of it, and I think that was sort of the problem. The sequence would be expanded into a 2-page story that almost ended up in Doubly Dark and Deadly. This is a short story called Believe in Ghosts. Believe in Ghosts is not entirely a deleted scene because this was reprinted later on in Bone-Chilling Tales of Scapula, and if you were a Kickstarter backer for Greatest Freak Show of All, you saw it included in the digital zine called Road to the Freak Show. Late night, Scapula's back home again, and as usual, he's ruminating over a scheme that just does not work. He has experimented with that handful of Diosukuri silicone, the ashes, so to speak. The problem, though, is that Scapula is not a scientist, so whatever secrets that this nanite sand may hold, it's not something he's going to be able to figure out. Maybe a geneticist could figure it out for him. He'd have to kidnap one and blackmail them or bribe them or yada yada yada. Either way, for here and now, for this night, for this lonely, frustrated night, it's not going to happen. Scapula is remarking now, very cryptically, that science is going to fail, then he's going to keep on trying the supernatural. Bone China's still there. She's still an angel statue. This is not good enough for someone like him. It's one thing to have her body, but the endless memory of his failure to win over her love and to have her with him for all time or whatever, that's what's driving him nuts. He's adamant that he can fix this problem, but of course, it's just not working. What's driving Scapula to this? Well, we have a little bit more of the internal monologue that shows that, he he wants her forgiveness, he wants her love. I usually don't like spelling things out this blatantly, because I like to have readers sort of figure things out for themselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why I didn't go with either this epilogue or the previous one, is just because it's a little too fill in the blanks for readers. Readers should be able to figure out by now what's motivating Scapula, or at least definitely in regards to Bone China. It does lead to sort of this fun next page with where he's imagining what not only just bringing her back, but what he could do if he could bring her back again and again and again and just have multiple Bone Chinas. This was almost a story that happened. I had almost considered a hardcore horror story to be included in here, where the Bone China corpse is brought back to life and replicated again and again, and that would have led to some pretty horrific stuff, or basically it's a little reanimator-ish, a little zombie-ish and stuff like that. But I ultimately decided not to do that, because I think that would have been a little too long of a story to include it in there. And we've had enough body horror with the previous tale. The epilogue here is mostly just about quieting down and going with more of a spooky mood than flat-out gross-out horror. What's going to stop his train of thought is the train of thought that always stops him when he's thinking. That is the evil thoughts. If you're a longtime Scapula reader, you could probably figure out whose voice this is, and every one of them would hate you. It wouldn't matter how many times you brought her back, fool, or if I should be using the right voice for the character we're talking about here. It wouldn't matter how many times you brought her back, fool! Bring her back again and again, and nothing would change. I don't think Dark Evil Hell Deathman would sound like that in his head, even though he sounded like that in person.
Hey! Hey, you there! Hey! 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 Look at me! Look at me! Look at me! I
Interacting with the sock on a person's hand.
so unprofessional.
Sorry.
In his head, it's the dragon, and the dragon would sound a lot more imposing than that.
Bring her back again and again and nothing would change.
Again, going back to Memento Mori and that very painful end that happened between Scapula and Bone China, and the last words she ever spoke to him, you've played those same 3 words in your head for years on end, and if you're like Scapula, and yeah, if you're like me, painful memories, they almost play out as if it was like a crystal clear videotape, and stuff like that can be very hard to deal with, which is exactly why maybe you could say a lot of this ends up in the comics to help deal with that. In general, for comic artists in general, not me. We have this long, painful tirade here, which I'm going to let you guys read for yourself because it is a little hard to go through, where it's basically just beating him down and the stupid wish to bring her back, even though bringing her back to life, even if it could happen, it wouldn't solve a damn thing. Scapula, of course, is crushed by these thoughts, but Scapula being Scapula is not going to quite give it up. He's going to resist it. He's going to say, I can do this. I can make it right. Soon. Of course, that would have also set up the events of Greatest Freak Show and what is motivating him there too, and a lot of what happens in Greatest Freak Show regarding him and his obsession with bringing Bone China back and the belief that supernatural powers would do it. Why did this scene not end up in the comic? 2 reasons. Number 1, even though it's not a bad sequence at all, but it is very, very similar to the way that Memento Mori ended. Going back to that book, there was a very, very similar sequence where he's preserving the body, that the voice of the dragon in his head is beating him down and telling him, you're a fool for thinking about this. I can't stand repeating myself, and I really gotta make it clear, I can't stand repeating myself. And if it felt too much like going back over territory that I had already explored. Now, granted, Memento Mori was not a book that a lot of Scapula readers have because it was in such limited stock, but at the same time, even for my sake, this felt a little bit too much like going back over something I had already established and just wasting pages in this new book to establish again. The second reason why I didn't go with this is that it felt way too teasery. And anybody who's been watching movies for like the last 10, 15 years is sick to goddamn death of teasers and things and movies that are endlessly setting up the next movie or endlessly setting up a franchise or endlessly thinking that if you have a cutscene mid-credits or after the credits, that's going to trick you into wanting to see the next one. And they're all the same and they're all boring and I'm sick to death of every last bit of them. And if I'm sick of something, then I have no right to use it in my own work. I want to give people something new, and all of that led to the decision to go with a whole new story, which was called Dominion. Rather than show Scapula lamenting over Bone China again, as we've seen before, let's just show Bone China and showing what she is to him in a new story. Those of you guys who read the book already know it takes place inside Scapula's head. It actually shows Bone China and shows what Scapula's obsession means. Not just to her and not just to himself. But yeah, it was just doing something new with what we have. Could it have worked with both? It could have worked with the first version of the epilogue, the one-page version. Maybe that would have worked with Dominion, maybe not. Dominion, in the end, is a little bit more of a comical story. It's black humor. It's a little bit sort of a screw you to everybody involved with it. But in the end, I decided just go with Dominion because I think that's for the best. Rather than loading on ending after ending after ending like this was friggin' Return of the King. Let's go with the ending that has the most impact. And that was Dominion. And that was Scapula, Doubly Dark and Deadly. And now are we done? And that's our show. Thank you so very much for watching, creepy kids. If you would like to support me in my comic creating endeavors, please consider joining us on patreon.com/Scapula, and also visit the Scapula bookstore. Buying the books really helps me out a lot, and it makes sure that I can continue making weird comics and entertainment just for all of you. Thank you so much, guys. See you next time.